welcome to the Better Together podcast. And this is a session of one conversation. So with one conversations, we look at one magazine and we look at some of the particular articles in each particular edition. And today we're looking at an article called On the Brink. It's by Miss Brenda Evans. It's a very important article for all of us to read and to think about. And so, Miss Brenda, thank you for taking the time to join us here today.
You're welcome. I'm very glad to do it.
Now, when I read this article, I thought, wow, this had to be kind of difficult to write. It sounds like you're doing some soul searching and you're really kind of thinking through some things with this particular article.
Well, I think Bill and I have come, maybe it's because we say we're young old, but maybe we're really old. We've come to the place for a number of years, really, that we don't mind talking about death. We don't think our conversation about it, making plans, writing things down on paper, we just don't think that's going to speed it up. And if it does, how can we lose? Frankly, but I think that's really part of it. We are really not afraid to talk about death. Neither is longing for it. We just aren't. But we know that it's going to happen, or the Lord's going to come first, and we'll meet Him in the air. Either way, we're going to be with Him forever. So we're not afraid to talk about it, and I'm not afraid to write about it. Really.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I also think about, Mr. Bill's work, with the retirement and some of the tables you talk about, life expectancy and so forth. He had to know all that like the back of his hand, I'm sure. So in a way, you're kind of uniquely equipped and prepared to write this. But for you, you're like, this is something we talk about. We all need to prepare for it. And it really is something, it's coming no matter what. So we do want to prepare for it, don't we?
Yes. And, as I thought about our conversation today, I'm not sure I made it all that clear in the article itself, but I think there are practical things that we need to do as far as preparing. And then for me, there are spiritual and emotional, and I put those two together. Now, you are a psychologist, and maybe I shouldn't throw emotional in with spiritual, but I'm going to for my layman's perspective. But I think the practical is important. Do you want me to go ahead and say some things about that now?
Yeah, well, first off, let's go ahead and say it's okay to put the emotional and the spiritual together. If you think about it, 1 Kings 19, Elijah, some would say he became too emotional, and maybe even John the Baptist there in the basement of that prison. So emotion is a good thing. But what you're saying is you're kind of trying to tie it together and you're trying to, but also be factual and think about what is it we need to prepare for? What do we need to do? And I did want you to talk a bit about, in the article, you mentioned your son, Lee, is kind of the executor of your estate. And so I thought that was very valuable, what you were saying, to get together and how you can prepare and make things better for your family, after the passing of one of you. So share that with us.
Yes. And not only that, it will help either one of us. Maybe we won't go at the same time, although frankly, I think we'd like to, not in some horrible suffering accident, but just, go to be with the Lord right away together. But we don't have that choice. But whichever one survives, we still know that these documents are there for him or for her, for me or for Bill, but also for our son. And we spent about half a day. We had Xeroxed copies of, they already had, our sons had copies of our wills, our living will, our POA, power of attorney. He's also our power of attorney. But we collected things like our retirement account numbers and figures, annuities, insurance, all of those legal things that we needed to put out there in his hands. And I think it's important. In fact, I just read recently someone else in Wall Street Journal who thinks those documents are important and should be out there, either with the executor or in a safe place that the executor knows about. Either one of those would work. But we've just, and also there, let's say you don't have a will or you don't have a trust, you haven't made estate plans, call on our Free Will Baptist Foundation. They have lots of good advice. They even have some things you can do that they can help you with to make plans if you hadn't. It's a kindness, Eddie.
It is.
It's a kindness
Absolutely.
to our children, but it's also scriptural. And I ran across a verse just the other day in Proverbs 22. And I don't know all that this verse applies to, but I took it as something that fits this situation. It says the prudent man sees danger ahead or sees ahead and spots dangers or troubles or whatever. And the insinuation is that he does something if there is something he can do. But the verse goes on and says something like the simple-minded, the unthinking person does nothing and just goes on blundering along. And I think that's the last thing we want to even consider doing at the end of our life, is pushing off things and others having to blunder on because of us.
That's excellent. And so you might as well, you've got it, and it's better to prepare when things are calm, when people are in good health. And you mentioned, I think it's a kindness to your family. So then your sons in the aftermath, it's a sad time. We know you're in heaven, but it still hurts. And so it's easier to have all those things together. It's also a better steward. You mentioned like the estate plan. It's just being a better steward of what you have, that it's more likely to be able to be used well for the Lord and for your family. So you're saying, don't pretend like it's not going to happen. It's going to happen. Prepare for it and make the best. Now, in our email, you
also,
oh yes,
I don't know if you're going to mention this or not, but one of the things that has occurred with Bill and me, we have over these 58 years, and we just celebrated our anniversary Monday of this week.
Happy
Thank you. Over these 58 years, we have moved 13 times and lived in 6 states, from New Hampshire to California. And we always assumed in those years when we were all over the map, we lived in southern Georgia and we lived in the Midwest in Missouri for years. We always assumed that we might be buried at my home church there in Middle Tennessee. And yet we've lived here in Ashland now because we have 2 sons here. We've decided we won't be buried there. We will be buried here in Ashland. And I think for ministerial families who are very transient, maybe for right now you've made that decision and your children wouldn't have to. Maybe you haven't nailed that down. Maybe you'll make a decision for now, and if you move somewhere else. But I think where you're going to be buried, of all things, is something relevant to think about and make some plans for, plus your service. Our sons are going to speak at our service. We've asked them to, and I know they will. So again, what scriptures do I want read? What hymns or contemporary songs do I want at my funeral? At least I think I do now.
Wow.
So those things are jotted down, and I think it's an important thing.
Oh, exactly. So figuring out where to be buried at, thinking about what songs, what the service is like. And if you're listening now, think about how quick, that happens. It's just the day after, usually you meet with a funeral home, you're making arrangements. If you've already picked out, how you want it to be, how much easier that is on the family. And then, giving some direction. These are favorite verses. Really, really helps as far as being prepared and it being meaningful,
Yeah.
being a great celebration of your life as well.
Yeah. Yeah, and one of the things we've said, we don't want you to talk a long time. No big
We'll have to break
accolades.
this one back out at that point, and say, and remember, she said that. This is good. Though I do want people to read the article. We're kind of expanding on it. So that was a little expansion of something you had said, but you gave some points that I hope people will go, they'll read the article, and I hope they'll share it like on social media and all. But one of the things you mentioned was to live in hope. And
Yes.
that's kind of it's kind of like an overall theme, if you will. So how about expanding on that a little bit too?
Well, I think it's important for me. I assume it is for other Christians of whatever age. And as I've thought a little further about it, some things that I didn't put in the article, I think there is what I've come to call now hope and then hope. And that then hope is that hope for forever. And then hope is not a problem for me at all. It is steadfast and sure. One of these days I will either die, my body will be put in the grave, but I will immediately be, as Paul says, in the presence of the Lord. And then there's going to be a resurrection, and I'm going to have the immortal, imperishable body. But also, it's the now hope that I find harder. And that means hope for this day, for this week, if I'm alive this week. And it's something that I've spent a lot of time thinking about. And in some ways, I guess I've prepared for, I guess I'm ravenous, maybe. I'm hungry for whatever will goad me into staying firm in my hope in the Lord for the now time, for today, for the trials and worries. And I just love a little Emily Dickinson poem. She always writes, almost always, in 12 lines, and uses that old hymn meter or common meter. Some people say she probably composed poetry in church while the preacher was preaching, remembering the da 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 of the hymns that they had sung. This is just the first 4 lines of a poem, and she never titles them, so here goes. Hope is the thing with feathers that perches in the soul and sings the tune without the words and never stops at all. And despite the fact that I like her poetry a lot, I don't always agree with her theologically. Yeah. And this happens to be one of the interesting poems that I like about her, and I've never really forgotten it since the first time I read it. Although I don't think it's not strong theology for me, because this week a Carolina wren was perched on our deck chair, a bird, a thing with feathers. And he flitted about, just turning back and forward on the perch for a little while on the back of the chair. And then he raised his beak to the sky and sang. It seemed like for 5 minutes, his unique song. It probably was 60 seconds at the most, but it was wonderful, in other words. But then, you know what he did, Eddie?
What?
He flitted away. If hope is a thing with feathers, it's going to flit away. Or maybe it's like our red-shouldered hawks that land in our backyard. And they don't flit away. They raise those great wings and they lift themselves and soar away. So I don't want faith that's the thing of feathers. I want something more solid, secure, that's going to hold me. And I think that's why I love the scriptures. So, and I'm thinking particularly of Philippians 3 and 4. If you haven't read them, I know they're among the most familiar 2 chapters in the whole New Testament, I think, because they have so much good stuff.
Yeah.
But I love one of the things Paul says down in chapter 3. I am not already perfect. And I'm thinking, wow, that's me. And then he goes on to say, but I press on. I press on. And further in those 2 chapters, and I'll have to look at my notes here to remember all of them. I jotted down, there are a bunch of strong verbs that are relevant to me. Not only do I'm not perfect, but I press on. I stand firm. I rejoice. I guard certain things. I think. Remember verse 8 of chapter 4? Things to think on. I think it's verse 8.
Yeah.
Then he goes on to say, I learn, or I have learned. I'm going to practice. He says to us, practice these things. I guess I'm saying hope is not a do-nothing thing.
Yeah.
Now hope, that kind of hope for today and tomorrow, is not a do-nothing thing. It is something we can do something about and stimulate and goad and feed.
Excellent. And so it's the harder part, as you said, to do now, but camp out in Philippians 3 and 4. And, and you know, you think about where he's at and all. So it's a good example. And you mentioned verse 8, thinking on these things. So we got to be active and and we keep pressing on. That's good. That's good stuff, shall we say.
Well, you know, the Old Testament has good stuff too. And one of my favorite major prophets is Jeremiah. The prophets are always hard for me. And I plunged through all of them last year. And this year, I'm just taking little bites here and there. But Lamentations 3, Jeremiah, that's that verse that we all know about, his mercies being new every morning and great is his faithfulness. One Sunday, several months ago, before COVID-19 changed things for us, one of our sons, Jeff, our oldest son, was speaking in church on this chapter, Lamentations 3, and he mentioned those things about the mercies new every morning and great is his faithfulness. But he moved on down in the chapter and had some real good thoughts, and my eyes just sort of wondered. You know how we are when preachers are preaching or speaking, sometimes we let our eyes go other places. It went on down, way down to verse 58 of Lamentations 3. And it says, I will take up your cause. And oh my goodness, the Lord just spoke to me. The Holy Spirit says, you know what? He's taken up my cause. I know Jeremiah was writing that hundreds of years ago to other people, but I've taken it for mine too.
Yeah.
And then there's Deuteronomy. How many times in Deuteronomy does the Lord say to the people, the Israelites, you are my treasured possession? And I've taken those. It's 3 or 4 times in Deuteronomy. We are his people and his treasured possession. And that also gives me hope for today, not just the future, but for today. Now, hope.
That's excellent. That is excellent, Miss Brenda. So we want people to read the article. You got a little extra here, but to read the article. There's practical aspects, but you're kind of getting back to how you started the article out. You know, it is kind of you mentioned looking over into the Grand Canyon, and that's kind of, you know, we all get to a particular point. We hit a milestone. We're 50, we're 70, we're 80, and how much more? And that's kind of what you're getting at. And that's maybe the hardest part of all. But what you're saying is, oh, the word gives me hope, and oh, it gets me through that. So that's wonderful. Well, hey, I just appreciate you writing this article and so many others. You know, you have written a lot for us, and it's kind of neat to get the behind the story, and then to realize this, what was it, 2-page article we could have got 10, you know, so that is all right. Well, thank you for stopping by and spending some time with us today.
Yes. Do I have just a minute more?
You do.
I just recently reread C.S. Lewis's Chronicles of Narnia, and some of them I think I had never read, even though our sons were all fans of them. And in Magician's Nephew, he sends, Aslan sends Diggory and Polly to the Western Wild to get an apple off this specific tree. And you know, in literature, the West, unlike my husband's love of Westerns and all things turning out well for those cowboys and all of that, the West in literature is often a dark place that often suggests death. But they're to go get this apple off the tree and bring it back. And they're riding Fledge, the winged horse that used to be Strawberry, the plain old horse in London. Now Aslan has given him wings. And this is Aslan's instructions to Diggory and Polly. Do not fly too high. I'll have to read this because I'm not good at memorizing. Do not fly too high, said Aslan. Do not try to go over the tops of the great ice mountains. Look for the valleys, the green places, and fly through them. There will always be a way through.
Wow, that's powerful.
There will always be a way through. Do you call that hope?
Yes.
Wow.
Coming out through literature.
Yes.
Good.
Yes.
Well, that is good. That's, as we say, good stuff, Miss Brenda. Thank you for sharing it with us today. Thank you for your writing. We'll probably have to have you back, talk about some of your other writings for us in one conversations as well. So keep that in the back of your head if you can get away from Mr. Bill for long enough, and we'll try to make that happen, okay?
Okay, thank you.
And we want to thank all of you who were listening in today. We want to encourage you to subscribe to the One Magazine if you've not already done so. You can share. You can go online and you can get a digital copy of this magazine, and you can share articles like the one that Miss Brenda has written and others. And we encourage you to, if you're on social media, to go to like the One Magazine page, to like the Better Together podcast. Every little bit you do helps us to get the message out, and it's the message of hope that you have really heard today. Thank you for being with us today, and may God bless you.